The man stepped through the polished front doors of the very expensive bar. He looked tired, completely out of money, and totally out of place. The rich customers didn't even turn their heads. The managers, in their sharp suits, glared at him instantly. But Serena, a black waitress who spent every single shift holding on to her dignity, saw something different in his face. She saw a fellow human who was hurting. Before we begin, write your name and where in the world you are watching from in the comments below. When the tired man reached her station, he leaned in close and whispered the painful truth. He could only afford a glass of water and a small plate of French fries. What Serena did next made him freeze right where he stood, speechless. That one small, kind action changed both their lives forever, because it was the key that unlocked a secret powerful enough to tear the entire restaurant apart. What exactly happened in that moment? And why did people try so hard to cover it up? Serena's workdays started long before the sun came up and didn't end until the late-night dinner rush was completely over. The fancy bar where she worked loved to boast about its shining floors and its wealthy customers, creating an image of total perfection. But for Serena, it was a constant fight to be treated fairly. She was one of the only black women working on the floor. She had learned how to navigate the silent rules. Smile when you feel insulted, swallow your anger, and survive the nights when her tips disappeared, or when managers made her feel like she wasn't even there. She pushed through every shift, driven by the quiet strength her family had taught her for years. She had hopes, she had bills, and she had people counting on her. But in that bar, she always felt the heavy load of unfairness that everyone around her pretended not to see. The wealth surrounding her glittered. Meanwhile, she was always just one unexpected bill away from total disaster. Her kindness toward customers was real, but it was rarely recognized, especially by the management. Far across the city, high up in a tall office, William Carter sat looking at the problems. He owned the bar. The reports sitting on his desk made no sense. Too many employees were quitting suddenly. There were strange missing amounts in the tips being paid out. He had even received a secret message suggesting that theft and cruel behavior were happening deep inside his business, eating away at the good name his father had built. The papers and the numbers weren't enough to show him the truth. If he truly wanted to know what was going on, he had to see the place through the eyes of the people who worked there every day. He made a quiet decision. He would step into the world his staff lived in. That choice, that simple decision to go undercover, was about to collide with Serena's life in a way neither of them ever expected. The night William walked into the bar, dressed up as a normal, broke customer, Serena's simple, deep kindness became the spark that exposed everything. The truth waiting for them on the other side of that moment would change both their lives for good. That night began just like countless others for Serena. Overbooked tables, customers who were impatient, and a manager who watched her every move, not with respect, but with cold suspicion. She was the only black woman working the floor during the busiest hours, and she carried a massive burden of expectations that none of her white coworkers ever had to face. The air inside the gilded cage was thick and cool, smelling faintly of expensive perfume and the sterile promise of perfection. William Carter, usually the invisible hand governing this environment from above, felt immediately exposed and completely out of place. His clothing, a deliberately chosen ensemble of faded denim and a cheap, slightly frayed jacket, was not merely casual. It signaled financial failure in a space built exclusively for success. The host, a young man with a perfectly practiced smile that instantly vanished when he registered William's attire, gave a barely perceptible jerk of the head toward the bar area. William was not escorted to a table. He was ushered aside near the rear service corridor, in the area reserved for quick drinks or people waiting for takeout. It was the corner where the clatter of silverware and the insistent whoosh of the kitchen door could drown out quiet conversation. Seated at the small, wobbly table, William felt the subtle pressure of every glance from the surrounding clientele. They were impeccably dressed, their judgment delivered with surgical precision, not through words, but through the quick, assessing slide of the eye that moved from his worn jacket to the cheap laminate surface of his table. He was an interruption, a smudge on the polished mirror of their evening. Within minutes, Serena approached. She moved with an economy of motion, honed by years of walking thousands of steps on hard floors. Her face was set in a mask of professional exhaustion, but when she reached his table, her posture shifted. She didn't look down at him or rush him. She offered a genuine, though tired, measure of respect. "Welcome. What can I get started for you tonight?" she asked, her voice low and even, treating him exactly the same way she had just treated the hedge fund manager in the booth across the room. William felt a nervous tightening in his chest. He hadn't rehearsed this part. He had planned to observe, not interact. He cleared his throat, trying to sound like a man simply budgeting, not a man playing a part. "Just water, please," he said, avoiding eye contact and focusing on the menu in his hands. He scanned the prices, his gaze landing on the single cheapest item available. And, just a side order of the truffle fries. Serena nodded, but she didn't immediately walk away. Her eyes briefly scanned his face, then flickered down to his hands, which were tightly gripping the worn edge of the paper menu. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the deep discomfort that went beyond being new to the place. It was the look of someone carefully calculating if the small order of fries was worth dipping into necessary rent money. She knew that look well. It was the look she wore every morning as she checked her bank balance. She knew the policy: no unauthorized food. Waste was inventory control, and inventory control was profit. But she also knew the reality. The kitchen had prepared 4 staff meals, basic chicken and rice, before the dinner rush, and only 2 had been claimed. The other 2 were already cooling down, scheduled to be scraped into the trash bin before closing. Serena leaned in slightly, lowering her voice so that it barely traveled beyond the small circle of their table. "The fries will take a few minutes," she said gently. "Listen, the kitchen usually throws out the staff meals if they aren't taken. It's just simple chicken and rice. Would you like a plate while you wait? It's no trouble. It'll just go to waste otherwise." She made the offer sound like a practical solution to a waste problem, not an act of charity, protecting his dignity. William looked up, surprised by the sudden, profound human kindness. He hesitated, then gave a small, grateful nod. "If it's truly going to waste, thank you." "That is very kind." Serena gave him a small, brief smile, the first real smile William had seen in the building, and turned toward the kitchen. She returned quickly, placing a heavy white bowl of plain, hot food down next to his water glass. The fries would come later, but the simple, filling meal was immediate. The exchange, quiet and subtle as it was, did not escape the notice of floor manager Garrett. Garrett operated from the center of the room, near the host stand, a large looming figure whose job seemed less about service optimization and more about surveillance. Garrett watched Serena constantly, applying a microscopic level of scrutiny that none of the bar's younger white servers ever received. The moment he saw the staff bowl, distinct from the customer serving bowls, placed on William's table, Garrett's eyes narrowed into slits of cold fury. He pushed off the host stand and moved across the floor with an alarming, smooth speed, ignoring the 2 waiters who tried to ask him quick questions as he passed. He stopped directly beside Serena, not bothering to address William at all. "Serena, step aside," Garrett said, his voice clipped and dangerous, low enough not to panic the surrounding patrons, but loud enough that William heard every syllable clearly. Serena froze. She knew the game. She knew she was caught. She instinctively stepped away from the table, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Garrett didn't wait for her to answer. He turned his attention to the bowl of food on William's table, pointing down at the simple meal with a rigid, accusing finger. "This food is inventory, Serena," Garrett hissed, looking at the server, not the guest. "Did the customer pay for this?" Serena kept her voice steady, attempting to explain the situation clearly, attempting to diffuse the tension. "No, sir. It was a staff meal that was going to be discarded. I offered it to him while he waited for his order." Garrett scoffed, a short, ugly sound. "Discarded? We discard nothing in this house without prior management approval. You cut into profit. You understand that, right? Even if the item is minutes from the bin, it's still potential profit, until I sign off on it." He leaned closer to her, his face inches from hers, projecting an intense, dominating anger. "The official policy is zero tolerance for inventory erosion. You know this. This is theft of service, Serena. Did you charge your table for the plate of chicken and rice?" "No, sir." "Right. So you are buying it. The cost of that meal, $14.50, is coming directly out of your tips tonight. Consider that deducted immediately." The immediate deduction was painful, but it was not the worst part. Garrett wasn't finished. He needed to make an example of her, ensuring the other servers, and William, the target of her kindness, understood the price of stepping out of line. "And you know what else, Serena? You've been wasting time. Too much time with Table 4. Too much time trying to play philanthropist. I looked at the schedule for the next 3 days. Friday is slow. You are cut from Friday's dinner shift. Don't bother coming in." He took her off the floor, effectively cutting the single most lucrative shift of the week, a crippling financial punishment for a small, discarded meal. Garrett delivered the edict with complete composure, his authority absolute. He didn't wait for a reply, just spun on his heel and walked back to the host stand, leaving Serena standing alone by the table, silently humiliated. William watched the entire exchange, the food suddenly heavy in his stomach. The humiliation was total, immediate, and utterly disproportionate. He saw the flicker of deep anger in Serena's eyes, quickly suppressed and replaced by a cold, resigned stillness. She had been punished not for incompetence, but for simple human kindness. He looked down at the meal she had risked her job and her paycheck to provide. It tasted like ash now. William realized, in that stark moment, that the problem at the Gilded Cage wasn't merely missing tips. Too, it was a structure of deliberate cruelty and absolute unchecked managerial power, wielded against those who could least afford to lose. The ease and confidence with which Garrett had punished Serena, a clear, targeted attack, was far more damning than any numbers William had seen on a spreadsheet back in his corporate tower. He had witnessed the system working exactly as designed, grinding down the resilient until they broke. The ease and confidence with which Garrett had punished Serena, a clear, targeted attack, was far more damning than any numbers William had seen on a spreadsheet back in his corporate tower. He had witnessed the system working exactly as designed, grinding down the resilient until they broke. William pushed the plate of fries away, the grease suddenly tasting like moral compromise. He wasn't merely a customer anymore. He was a liability, a witness. And now, he realized, he was the only one in the room, apart from Serena, who understood the weight of that interaction. He lowered his gaze, focusing on the polished granite of the bar counter, but his eyes were constantly scanning. He needed to see more than the data. He needed to see the operational reality. Garrett, buoyed by the small, successful exercise of power, spent the next 30 minutes moving through the room. William watched him engage with a young white bartender, laughing loudly at a joke, slapping him on the shoulder, casual and familiar. 5 minutes later, Garrett was standing near Serena, his face blank, his voice an immediate shift in tone, sharp, demanding, cutting through the background noise. "Serena, that section is dirty. I need those napkins folded now," Garrett ordered, his gaze lingering long enough to feel like a challenge. The napkins were perfectly stacked, William noticed. They were always perfectly stacked when Serena was responsible. William leaned back on his stool, pretending to check his phone. He had activated the audio recorder hidden in the lapel of his worn jacket. He watched Serena move. She worked twice as fast, twice as cleanly, as the other servers. But where her white colleagues were granted quick breaks, shared jokes, and invisible downtime, Serena operated under a spotlight. Every trip to the kitchen was tracked. Every interaction with a guest seemed to draw Garrett's attention like a magnet. The scrutiny was relentless, structural, and clearly targeted. If a mistake was made in her section, even by another server passing through, Garrett's immediate instinct was to find Serena and demand accountability. "Where were you when Table 12 needed their check?" Garrett demanded abruptly when Serena passed the host stand. "I was running drinks for Table 9, sir." "Mark took the check for 12, Serena replied, her voice low, professional, devoid of any visible annoyance. Garrett didn't even look at Mark, who was standing 3 feet away, counting cash. "That's not efficient, Serena. You need to prioritize your section. Focus. I expect better focus." He spoke loud enough for the host and the nearby busser to hear. It was a public dressing down designed not to correct a flaw, but to chip away at her dignity and remind everyone of his absolute control over her employment. William realized this was the hidden cost of the luxury facade. The illusion of perfection was maintained by the systematic exploitation of the most vulnerable staff. It was not mere petty theft of tips. It was a deep, racialized structure of intimidation designed to maximize output through fear and minimize compensation through punitive cuts. He started his covert operation in earnest. William had come prepared with small, sophisticated recording tools, items he was used to deploying in high-stakes corporate espionage, now used to catch a bully in a bar. He adjusted the small camera lens embedded in his wristwatch, focusing it subtly toward the service station. Around 8 o'clock, the nightly closing process began. Garrett retreated into the small, glass-walled office near the service bar, a space designed to offer him surveillance over the entire floor. He pulled up the digital ledger that tracked sales and auto-calculated the tip pool for the evening staff. William watched as Garrett accessed the system. Garrett opened a second, hidden document on the side of the screen. He studied the nightly numbers, then began making adjustments to the shared tips. William focused the small camera, zooming in digitally on the screen. He caught Garrett manually changing the allocation percentage, slightly reducing the staff collective share before it was distributed to their digital payroll. Garrett did this with practiced speed, a quick, familiar gesture. It was a fractional deduction, perhaps only 5% of the total pool, but across 10 servers over several weeks, it amounted to thousands. Once the digital theft was complete, Garrett leaned back, satisfied, and pulled out a stack of paper currency. The cash tips left by patrons who preferred not to use card. These tips were supposed to be pooled and converted. William watched as Garrett separated the pile into 2 stacks. A small, token stack that went into the office safe labeled payroll, and a much thicker stack that Garrett carefully folded and slipped into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. Clean, blatant theft, captured from 3 different angles. William felt a cold, clinical satisfaction mixed with a deep, sickening anger. He had proof of the crime, the method, and the target, Serena. While Garrett finalized his internal accounting, the focus momentarily shifted back to Serena. She was meticulously clearing the last tables in her section, the forced perfection still intact. The incident with the fries had drained her, but it hadn't broken her stride. The humiliation was a fresh, hot burn. But Serena had learned long ago that emotion was a luxury she couldn't afford on the clock. Every ounce of energy had to go into her work, because failure meant starvation, and the small family she supported needed her paycheck intact. Serena moved with the automatic grace of someone who treated hard work as a spiritual necessity. She knew that simply doing her job was not enough. She had to document the injustice, because if she didn't, no one else would believe it. It had started 6 months earlier, a feeling of unease when her paycheck consistently came up short. Then it became a pattern. Shifts randomly cut from 20 hours to 15 the night before, tips from large parties vanishing entirely, and the quiet, discriminatory remarks that left her feeling small and exposed. She waited until the very end of the night, when the floor was clear and the managers were busy locking up the main liquor cage. Serena slipped into the small, rarely used storage room near the employee entrance. It smelled faintly of industrial cleaner and stale uniforms. She pulled her worn canvas bag from the hook. Buried beneath her spare apron and a laminated copy of the new cocktail menu was a single, battered manila envelope. It was soft and creased from months of being hidden and handled. Serena pulled out the contents: small slips of paper, index cards, and even the backs of old receipts. Each was covered in her neat, precise handwriting. It was a meticulous accounting ledger of injustice. She pulled a fresh index card from her purse and sat on an inverted bucket, the fluorescent light buzzing harshly above her. She documented the night's events. Date: 10/24, 8:15 p.m. Incident: meal deduction, small fries. Cost assessed: $15. She knew the actual cost was less than $1, but the charge was arbitrary and punitive. Consequence: 4 hours cut from Tuesday morning shift, lost $80 potential wages, plus tips. Manager: Garrett. Remarks: public humiliation. Accused of cutting into profit. She dated the entry, initialed it, and carefully placed the index card inside the envelope. She used paper because it left no digital trail that could be hacked or deleted. This was her physical evidence, her silent witness, her only protection against the enormous power structure that Garrett represented. The envelope contained records of every discriminatory assignment, every tip discrepancy over $20, and every instance of targeted verbal abuse. Serena knew the immense risk of what she held. If Garrett ever found this, she would not just lose her job. He would make sure she could never work in a decent restaurant again. But she also knew she couldn't trust the system to protect her. The moment she spoke without proof, the system would crush her under accusations of incompetence or racial bias. She had to wait for the moment of absolute leverage, the time when she felt safe enough to reveal the truth she carried. William Carter, still nursing his water at the bar, watched Serena reappear from the back hallway, her face impassive. He had captured the theft, but he hadn't yet grasped the full, agonizing extent of the targeted campaign. He only knew that the manager, Garrett, believed he was invincible. William paid for his meager meal, leaving a ridiculously large cash tip, far more than he was accustomed to tipping, but he wanted to inject some immediate, untraceable comfort into her night. Serena accepted the payment with professional reserve, her eyes briefly meeting his, a fleeting moment of shared understanding passing between the server and the disguised owner. She nodded, a gesture of quiet acknowledgement, and William left the gilded cage, his worn clothes feeling authentic now, covered in the dirt of corporate rot he had just uncovered. He drove away, the footage he had captured already being uploaded to a secure, private server. He had the proof of the money theft. But he knew, watching Serena work that last hour, that the deepest, most damaging crime was the exploitation of her dignity. The footage needed context. It needed the human story of targeted abuse. William realized the investigation was only beginning, and the evidence he needed now was not just numbers, but the meticulous, painful truth known only to the victim. Back inside the storage room, before clocking out, Serena picked up her bag and tucked the manila envelope back into its hiding spot. It was heavy, a small arsenal of truth against a Goliath of power. She zipped her bag closed, the silence of the locked-up bar amplifying the pounding of her own exhaustion. She was ready. She just didn't know when the fight would start. The following morning, the atmosphere inside the gilded cage was thick with uneasy silence. The staff had been summoned to a mandatory meeting in the opulent, rarely used private dining room, a space normally reserved for oil barons and discreet celebrity parties. Now, under the glare of harsh, unsoftened track lighting, the room felt sterile and judgmental. Waiters, bartenders, and kitchen runners filtered in, exchanging nervous glances. Most were wearing street clothes, looking tired and confused. Management meetings were usually brief, aggressive affairs led by Garrett, focused solely on upselling and minimizing costs. This sudden, early-morning summons suggested something major was wrong. The whispers revolved around terminations, maybe a sudden change in ownership, or worse, someone finding out about the petty theft happening on every shift. Serena arrived precisely on time. She carried her work bag, heavy not just with her wallet and keys, but with the weighty knowledge of what she had documented. Her nerves were raw, but beneath the fear was a hard, cold core of readiness. She looked around the room, reading the tension in the way her colleagues avoided eye contact. She knew, based on the previous night's humiliation, that the focus of this meeting was likely going to fall squarely on her. Garrett's cruelty, often extended to public shaming, meant to set an example. She sat down near the back, consciously trying to make herself small, bracing for the inevitable attack. Floor manager Garrett was holding court near the front, pacing the length of the long mahogany table. He looked tense, running a hand frequently over his perfectly slicked hair, but his arrogance remained intact. "Listen up, people," Garrett snapped, his voice too loud in the confined space. "We have an unscheduled corporate review today. Head office is sending someone down. They're checking compliance, efficiency. You all look sharp. Keep your mouths shut, and let me handle the questions. Anyone who throws shade at the system, or, God forbid, mentions anything about the inventory counts, will be on dish duty until 2050. A quiet murmur went through the room. Most of the staff knew Garrett was paranoid about his own small-scale corruption being discovered. He was trying to assert control, cementing the narrative that he was the one in charge, even when the corporate brass came down. Before anyone could fully settle, the heavy, varnished door at the back of the room swung open. A man stepped in. The immediate silence was profound, sharp enough to hurt the ears. The figure who entered bore no resemblance to the tired, broke man in worn clothes who had sat at Serena's station less than 12 hours earlier. William Carter was dressed in a charcoal suit that was clearly custom-made, the fabric catching the light with the subtle sheen of undeniable wealth. His shoes were polished mirrors. He stood straighter, his posture radiating quiet authority that had been expertly hidden beneath the disguise of failure. His expression was not angry, but devastatingly calm, his eyes moving slowly across the room, registering every face, every nervous tick. The staff froze. They had never seen the owner of the gilded cage, only heard distant, almost mythological stories of the billionaire living in the tower above them. But they instantly knew this man was not a middle manager sent for compliance checks. This was power, distilled and focused. Garrett, however, only saw a threat to his established hierarchy. He plastered on his practiced, oily smile and extended a hand, walking quickly toward the door. "Sir, welcome. I'm Garrett, floor manager," Garrett said, his voice dripping with false deference. "I'm assuming you're Mr. Harrison from operations?" We were just reviewing the morning? William didn't take his hand. He didn't even look at the outstretched arm. His eyes remained locked on Garrett's face, a slight, almost imperceptible shift in his expression that suggested profound contempt. "My name is William Carter," he stated, his voice carrying just enough weight to stop every nervous whisper instantly. "I am the owner of this establishment." The revelation hit the room like a physical shockwave. Staff members instinctively straightened their backs. Several faces went instantly pale, realizing that the man they had complained about, ignored, or mocked was standing right in front of them. Garrett's jaw slackened. The arrogance evaporated, replaced by frantic, defensive calculation. He retracted his hand slowly, trying desperately to salvage the situation. William walked past him, moving to the head of the table. He stood facing the entire staff, his hands resting on the polished wood. "Please sit down, Garrett," William instructed, the tone completely flat. It was not a request. Garrett stumbled back, obeying without a word, finding a chair near the corner. He looked like a puppet whose strings had been cut. William scanned the room again, finally letting his gaze settle briefly on Serena, who was watching him with an expression of stunned, guarded disbelief. He acknowledged her with the smallest movement of his head before beginning. "The purpose of this meeting is not to discuss upselling or inventory," William began, his voice clear and measured. "It is to discuss the integrity of the business and the integrity of the people who work here." He paused, letting the statement hang in the air. "I spent yesterday evening in this building," William continued. "Not in the penthouse, but on the floor. I observed the operations, the customer service, and, most importantly, the management structure." He focused his attention solely on Garrett now. "I had the distinct displeasure of observing one incident in particular last night that cemented my understanding of how this floor has been managed," William said. "A member of staff, who had performed flawlessly for the entirety of her shift, chose to offer a small act of kindness to a struggling customer. She offered food that would have otherwise gone into the trash bin. A gesture of human decency." Serena's heart hammered against her ribs. He was talking about the fries. He was the customer. The poor, tired man had been the owner all along. William continued, his voice hardening slightly. "The floor manager, Mr. Garrett, responded to this act of kindness with immediate, targeted cruelty. He publicly humiliated the employee, docked the arbitrary cost of the food from her tips, money she desperately relies on, and arbitrarily cut her hours for the rest of the week." The staff shifted uneasily. They all knew this behavior was standard for Garrett, but hearing it recounted by the billionaire owner of the bar felt terrifyingly serious. Garrett finally found his voice, a squeaky, defensive sound. "Mr. Carter, sir, that's a misunderstanding. That's server Serena. She has issues with policy compliance. We have standards here, rules about food waste." "Silence, Garrett!" William cut him off immediately. The two simple words delivered with the force of an avalanche. William didn't argue the policy. He simply dismissed Garrett's pathetic attempt to regain control. He stepped back from the table. With a click of a remote control, the lights in the room dimmed instantly, and a massive projection screen dropped silently from the ceiling, pulling taut inches from the wall. The sudden technical execution of the move only amplified William's command over the situation. A bright image flashed onto the screen, the grainy, familiar perspective of the high-definition security camera footage from the service bar area. "We are going to review some of the policy compliance in this establishment," William stated. The first video clip began. It was tightly focused on the area around the main cash register and the tip drop box. The timestamp matched the end of the Tuesday night shift. The camera showed Garrett, alone, after the last customer had left, and most staff had clocked out. He approached the drop box, which contained the pooled cash tips for the night. He opened the lock with a key he should not have possessed, as the box was supposed to be opened only by armored transport, and pulled out the heavy stack of bills. The video didn't cut or skip. It showed Garrett, with practiced ease, separating the bills. He took a rubber-banded stack, and, instead of placing it into the designated sealed envelope for accounting, he quickly slipped it into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. His movements were swift, furtive, and completely damning. A gasping sound came from the front of the room, quickly suppressed. The clip transitioned seamlessly to the next incident. This footage was from the computer station in the back office, the area where schedules were finalized. Garrett was visible, scrolling through the staff schedule software. The video clearly showed him highlighting Serena's name and manually reducing her scheduled shifts for the upcoming week from 5 down to 3, just minutes after the incident with the free meal. The manager's profile picture and administrative access information were clearly visible in the corner of the screen. Then came the clip that brought the systemic abuse into brutal focus. This was the raw, unedited footage from the service bar, capturing the full interaction from the previous night, including the audio. The volume of the speaker was high enough for everyone in the room to hear clearly. They saw Serena, exhausted but calm, handing William, in his disguise, the small plate of fries. They heard her quiet, compassionate offer. "Just get some rest, sir." Then, the camera spun slightly as Garrett barged into the frame, his face flushed with manufactured rage. They heard his voice, loud and demeaning. "Serena, what in God's name do you think you're doing? Giving away our profits? Do you think this is a soup kitchen?" The staff watched as Garrett pointed a demanding finger at Serena, forcing her to retrieve the plate. They saw him calculating the cost and loudly announcing the deduction from her tips. The footage didn't focus on the theft of money. It focused on the theft of dignity. The camera held on Serena's face for a long, painful second, her forced stoicism, the visible effort to keep her reaction locked down, the shame she was made to feel in front of a customer. The projection screen suddenly went black. The silence that followed was suffocating, heavy with the undeniable weight of truth. The gentle hum of the projector was the only sound. The collective realization dawned upon the staff. Their manager was not just stealing from the corporation, he was systematically abusing and exploiting the most vulnerable staff members, specifically targeting Serena. The racial bias that underpinned Garrett's relentless scrutiny was made obvious by the stark contrast between his polite interaction with a white colleague earlier that evening, footage William hadn't shown yet, but the staff knew existed, and his vicious attack on Serena. Garrett sat rigid in his chair. He was sweating profusely, the sharp creases of his collar dampening. He looked left, then right, seeking any shred of support, but his colleagues were staring straight ahead, unable to look at him, unwilling to risk getting caught in his collapsing structure of lies. William let the silence stretch, the emotional consequence of the video soaking into the room. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but it commanded every shred of attention. "I did not need this footage to confirm the financial theft," William stated, looking down at Garrett. "I have been monitoring the discrepancies for months, but I needed this footage to confirm the depth of the corruption and to confirm the targeted nature of the abuse against a specific employee who has done nothing but perform with professionalism and integrity, even while being deliberately victimized." He turned away from Garrett, addressing the whole room, his expression now one of deep disappointment. The manager of this establishment was not just stealing money. He was stealing peace of mind. He was stealing security. And he was stealing the basic respect due to every person in this room. He picked up the remote again, clicking the device in his hand, not for the screen, but as a deliberate distraction, drawing the eye. He took a deep breath, his gaze moving back across the room, searching again for Serena. "Serena," William said, his voice softer now, but carrying just as much authority. "Stand up, please." The silence that followed William's command was absolute, heavy with the weight of expectation. Every eye in the cramped meeting room swiveled to Serena. The fear was a physical chill against the heat of the room, but beneath the fear, a small, solid core of defiance had finally hardened inside her. She had been called out, but for the first time in years, she felt utterly protected. Serena slowly pushed her chair back. The vinyl seat creaked, a loud, unnatural sound in the sudden quiet. She stood up, her uniform crisp, her posture straight. She did not look at Garrett, whose face was a mask of calculated fury, nor did she look at her co-workers, whose expressions ranged from stunned curiosity to profound relief. She looked only at William Carter, who met her gaze with an even, respectful nod. "Thank you, Serena," William said, acknowledging her courage just in standing. "I know what I showed you was difficult, but I need you to confirm something for this group. When I spent the night here, sitting at the bar, I saw many things that did not appear on the security footage. Things that were targeted, personal, and aimed only at you. I want to know if you have been recording these incidents." Serena did not rush. She knew this moment was the only chance she might ever have to speak the complete, ugly truth. She reached down to the heavy canvas bag she had placed beside her chair, the bag she carried every day, full of bills and bus transfers. From the bottom of the bag, underneath a water bottle and an old book, she pulled out a standard, worn manila envelope. It was not pristine or crisp. It was softened by months of handling, the edges slightly frayed, the thickness uneven where receipts and tightly folded papers bulked the sides. She walked forward, stopping just short of the main conference table where William stood, and placed the envelope down. It landed on the smooth, polished mahogany with a soft, distinct thud. It was not just paper. It was proof of her survival. The other staff members leaned forward slightly, trying to read the blank surface of the envelope. Garrett, seeing the tangible evidence that contradicted his constructed reality, finally panicked. "What is that, Serena? Are these client complaints? Because I warned you your service was slipping. That's why your tips went down. It's performance, not theft. Everyone knows that." Garrett sputtered, desperation thinning his voice. William raised a hand, not toward Garrett, but toward Serena, acknowledging her offering. He didn't open the envelope. The act of placing it on the table was statement enough. "This envelope," William stated, speaking loudly over Garrett's fading whine, "contains the records Serena has kept, documenting every single shorted tip, every arbitrary shift reduction, every minute she was forced to stay late without clocking in, and every discriminatory remark made against her based on the color of her skin." The room sucked in a collective breath. It was no longer about a few $100s of theft. This was institutional abuse, meticulously tracked by the victim. Garrett immediately tried to twist the narrative, his voice straining with false authority. "That is irrelevant, Mr. Carter. That is insubordination. She kept these records because she was already lazy and trying to build a case to avoid disciplinary action. I assure you, Serena has always been a problematic employee. She lacks the professional demeanor we require here at the Gilded Cage, and frankly, she has a chip on her shoulder." "Stop talking, Garrett," William commanded. The two words hit the manager like a physical blow. William picked up his phone, which he had been using as a remote, and tapped a file. The screen flared back to life, but this time it showed a series of spreadsheets, not video. These were the internal records William had pulled the previous night, cross-referenced with the audio he had captured. "You say she lacks performance," William continued, his voice now dangerously cold. "Yet the footage I just showed proved she was consistently rated top 3 in guest satisfaction surveys until 6 months ago, when you personally began manipulating the internal reporting system to redirect her highest-paying tables to younger, white employees." William pointed to the screen, where lines of red data detailed systematic tip discrepancies that matched the dates on Serena's envelope. This isn't merely theft, Garrett. This is targeted economic warfare. You targeted her specifically because you believed she was vulnerable, because you thought she had the least power to fight back, and because you thought no one would believe her if she did. Garrett's face was pale, his eyes darting wildly. He looked to the other employees for support, but they averted their gazes, fixed on the floor or the wall. He was completely isolated. "I am the manager. I make the decisions," Garrett shouted, trying to salvage the wreckage of his authority. "I was managing performance. You can't just—" "I can," William interrupted, stepping closer. "Garrett, as of this moment, you are terminated." The word hung in the air, final and devastating. William did not allow the manager a moment to respond, to negotiate, or to plead. He nodded toward the double doors at the back of the room. Two figures stepped immediately inside. Large, silent men dressed in dark suits, security personnel who had been waiting for the signal. "The company car is waiting outside to take you home. You will not be permitted to collect your belongings from your office, which will be professionally sealed and inventoried. You are to be escorted out of this building immediately. If you attempt to communicate with any current employee, customer, or vendor of the Gilded Cage, we will pursue the full extent of criminal charges for fraud, theft, and corporate sabotage." The security men moved with practiced efficiency. Garrett backed away, stumbling over his own chair. His arrogance vanished, replaced by sheer terror. He was not just fired, he was erased. "This is wrong," Garrett protested, his voice now a pathetic squeak. "You can't treat me like this. I served this company." "You served yourself," William countered, standing stiffly until the security team reached Garrett, gripping his arms firmly. As they guided Garrett toward the exit, the manager thrashed weakly, twisting his head to look back at Serena, his eyes full of pure, poisonous resentment. Serena held his gaze steady, offering neither triumph nor pity. She simply watched him go. The heavy door closed with a firm, soft click, sealing the manager's fate and leaving a profound, echoing silence in the room. The entire event, from the moment William asked her to stand to the final shutting of the door, had taken perhaps 3 minutes, but it felt like the longest, most difficult hour of Serena's life. William turned back to the stunned staff, taking a moment to let the reality of what had just happened sink in. The threat was gone. The system had broken. He looked down at the envelope resting on the polished table, Serena's quiet record of the long war she had fought alone. He still hadn't touched it. "Now," William said, his voice regaining its controlled, authoritative tone, "let's discuss what happens next." William's words, heavy with finality, cut through the residual tension left by Garrett's sudden, humiliating exit. The staff remaining in the meeting room were frozen in place, a collection of bussers, hosts, and servers who had spent years navigating the floor manager's cruelty. They weren't experiencing simple relief. They were watching a mountain crumble. Their expressions ranged from white-faced shock to a deep, agonizing shame. Shame for having remained silent, for having internalized the fear, and for having occasionally benefited from Garrett's favoritism against others, particularly against Serena. The fluorescent lights of the service hallway seemed suddenly too bright, illuminating every stain on the carpet and every flicker of doubt in the employee's eyes. Serena remained standing, gripping the back of the folding chair, the sudden absence of the threat almost more paralyzing than its presence had been. William gave the staff a slow, measured assessment. He did not look angry, but his gaze was sharp and unforgiving. He understood that half the room was already terrified of retaliation, conditioned to believe that justice was temporary and power always reverted to the abusive status quo. "The person who just left this room," William stated, his voice even and controlled, was not an anomaly. He was a symptom. He moved slightly, leaning his hands on the table, closing the physical distance between himself and the shell-shocked workers. You were operating in an environment of calculated, sustained exploitation. I am the owner of this establishment. I am responsible for the standards, and I failed every single one of you. He paused, letting the statement sink in. It was not a soft apology seeking forgiveness. It was a firm acknowledgement of corporate liability, delivered with the serious weight of a judge reading a verdict. For years, we profited from the illusion of perfection, while systemic rot was encouraged through negligence and lack of oversight. William continued. That ends today. There will be an immediate, complete internal restructuring of how floor management operates, how tips are distributed, and how accountability is enforced. A collective, shaky breath went through the small crowd. They had heard promises before, usually after a big mistake or a minor incident, but never like this. Never delivered by the source of ultimate power, speaking directly to the people on the lowest rung. William made his first public commitment clear and absolute. I understand the scale of financial theft and the punitive wage deductions. Our accounting team is already calculating full financial restitution for every employee who has worked under Garrett for the past 6 months. This will be paid out quickly and discreetly. He then fixed his attention entirely on Serena, who felt the full force of the room's gaze shift back to her. The polished wood of the table gleamed between them. William finally picked up the thick envelope she had placed there, her months of diligent, dangerous work. He held it gently, as if it were fragile evidence from a crime scene. But the rot goes deeper than money, William stated, his voice lowering slightly, emphasizing the personal cost. This goes back to dignity. It goes back to the incident I personally witnessed last night. He recounted the moment in sharp detail. The simple act of kindness, Serena offering a struggling stranger a meal that was going to be thrown out, and Garrett's immediate vicious response, the humiliation, the tip theft, and the arbitrary scheduling cut that followed. Serena's immediate punishment for an act of basic human compassion was the key, William said, holding the envelope up slightly. It showed the entire goal of that regime. Not just profit, but control through psychological intimidation and targeted, racialized discrimination. He spoke directly to her, ignoring the others for a moment. Serena, your courage in continuing to do the job with integrity, even while being actively targeted, is what forced this entire truth into the open. That act of kindness last night, the refusal to let your fear override your dignity, was the first action that exposed Garrett's absolute confidence in his impunity. And this documentation, he tapped the envelope, your quiet proof, is why we can ensure this is not dismissed as a simple personality conflict. William placed the envelope back down, now treating it with almost reverence. You did what no one else dared to do. You documented the injustice you suffered. You believed in the value of the truth, even when the system was built to silence you. Serena could not speak. The pressure that had been locked in her chest for years, a heavy, suffocating weight composed of debt, fear, and the grinding effort of daily microaggressions, suddenly fractured and began to float away. It was a physical release. For the first time since she had walked into the gilded cage, she felt truly, undeniably seen. She had endured the pain of knowing the truth while everyone around her preferred the lie. Now, the person with the most power in the room had not only acknowledged the truth, but confirmed its validity and placed its value above everything else. She wasn't just a wronged employee. She was a witness who had changed the trajectory of a corporation. The shame on the faces of the other staff members was palpable now. They watched Serena, realizing the depth of her silent struggle and the cost of their own complicity. William knew that simply firing Garrett was insufficient. The culture of fear needed to be explicitly shattered. If you report a manager, if you speak up, if you point out a failure in the system, you will be protected, William declared, his voice rising, carrying the force of law. The culture of silence, the reliance on fear and intimidation, is over. If there is even a suspicion of retaliation, that individual will be dismissed immediately, with cause. I want that understood clearly by everyone present. He looked at Serena one last time, a brief, respectful nod of recognition. We will be discussing your specific compensation shortly. But know this, your restitution begins today. The staff began to stir, the rigid paralysis dissolving into murmurs of relief and uncertainty. The meeting was over, but the reality of the gilded cage had permanently changed. They were no longer working under the oppressive shadow of Garrett's cruelty, but under the harsh, unavoidable glare of accountability. Serena remained standing, the quiet warrior finally stepping out of the shadows. Her dignity not only intact, but validated by the highest authority. The heavy, grinding weight was gone, replaced by a sudden, exhilarating lightness, the recognition that justice, however difficult, was real. The staff began to stir, the rigid paralysis dissolving into murmurs of relief and uncertainty. The meeting was over, but the reality of the gilded cage had permanently changed. They were no longer working under the oppressive shadow of Garrett's cruelty, but under the harsh, unavoidable glare of accountability. Serena remained standing, the quiet warrior finally stepping out of the shadows, her dignity not only intact but validated by the highest authority. The heavy, grinding weight was gone, replaced by a sudden, exhilarating lightness, the recognition that justice, however difficult, was real. The weeks that followed were defined by a swift, brutal honesty. William Carter did not delegate the reform. He commanded it, appearing frequently on the floor, no longer in disguise, but in sharp suits that demanded attention. The first physical change was immediate and visible. The old, greasy cash register area, where tips were haphazardly tallied, vanished. In its place appeared sleek, tamper-proof digital terminals. Every server was given a small, personalized tablet. Tips were tracked in real time, displayed clearly, and reconciled automatically before payroll processing. The act of stealing a single dollar now required hacking a centralized, auditable system, a risk no one on the floor dared to take. Transparency was the new defense. The staff underwent mandatory sessions on anti-retaliation and workplace fairness. These sessions were awkward and silent at first, filled with people who were used to keeping their mouths shut. The instructors, brought in by William, did not mince words. They played scenarios showing microaggressions, racial biases in scheduling, and the subtle ways power had been abused. They established a clear, non-negotiable line. Kindness and fairness were now company policy, and the smallest act of targeted cruelty would be met with immediate termination. For Serena and other employees of color, the enforced clarity was like breathing clean air for the first time in years. They found themselves trusting the system enough to speak, not in fear, but in confidence. Serena, having been immediately repaid for all her lost tips and penalized meals, still worked her regular schedule, but the tension was gone. Managers treated her with a distant, professional respect. She was no longer scrutinized. She was simply serving. Then a thick envelope arrived, sealed with the official gilded cage stamp, containing a request for a private meeting with William Carter upstairs. She dressed carefully, feeling the stiffness of a blazer she hadn't worn in months. Stepping into the elevator that led to the executive floors was a disorienting journey. She emerged into a silent, sunlit corridor defined by white marble and clear glass, a world away from the steaming, clattering kitchen. William Carter met her at the door to his expansive office. He was relaxed but serious, offering her a chair facing the panoramic view of the city she served every night. "Serena," William began, foregoing pleasantries, "I'm not interested in apologizing again. Apologies are cheap. I want to talk about fixing the problem permanently." Serena leaned forward. "The system is changing, Mr. Carter. People feel it. But new systems need people who know the truth on the ground." "Exactly," William said, a slight nod confirming her statement. He pushed a folder across the polished desk. "When I came in undercover, I saw a woman who showed dignity and compassion under immense pressure. I saw someone who kept meticulous records, not out of malice, but out of necessity and professionalism. You didn't just survive the rot. You documented it for months, alone, knowing the risk." He tapped the folder. "We are creating a new position. Staff relations and compliance oversight. It will be a leadership role. Your job will be simple. Monitor the implementation of these new policies, ensure that the audit trails are working, and, most importantly, be the necessary voice for every person working the floor. You will be the firewall against the next Garrett." Serena stared at the title. It was a massive leap from her daily grind. She felt a familiar resistance. Was this charity? Was he trying to pay her off? "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice steady, "is this a reward for exposing the corruption, or is this a job based on my skill?" William looked directly into her eyes. "It is based on the fact that you have integrity I didn't see in the entire management structure I hired. You know the job better than anyone, and you have proven you are willing to risk your livelihood for what is right. That is a rare commodity. I need that skill. I need your eyes on the system, Serena." The clarification was crucial. This was not a pity promotion. It was a demand for her expertise. She picked up the folder, feeling the heavy paper beneath her fingers. She thought of her family, the endless tightrope walk of bills, and the constant strain of having to choose between quiet survival and justice. Now she could choose both, on her own terms. "I accept the role," she said, "but I want assurance that I report directly to you and that my decisions regarding unfair treatment, once documented, are final." "Agreed," William said immediately. "Welcome aboard, Serena." In the months that followed, the gilded cage truly began to change. The polished surfaces remained, but the illusion of perfection was replaced by a functioning, transparent structure. Serena shed her serving uniform for the crisp, professional clothes of an executive, but she never forgot the smell of the kitchen or the aching fatigue of a double shift. From her new office, she oversaw the digital tracking, reviewed scheduling for fairness, and, critically, conducted regular check-ins with the staff, ensuring no new manager could create the old atmosphere of fear. Her quiet act of kindness, giving a struggling man a free meal, had done more than save one night's hunger. It had triggered an earthquake that exposed and dismantled a deeply ingrained system of theft and inequality. Serena understood that this victory at the gilded cage was not the end of the war, but proof that the fight was possible. Systemic injustice was massive and complex, but it could always be pierced by simple human dignity and the undeniable truth contained in clear, cold evidence. She was no longer just a server surviving the system. She was an architect, ensuring that justice, for once, was built into the foundation. Now, we want to know what you thought. From 0 to 10, what score does this story deserve?